Sure to pronounce his last name. I think I just screwed it up right off the beginning. But Zach is a very talented designer. He does a lot of work inside of the theater scene, inside of New York and Broadway. So he's going to be giving a presentation on concepts and techniques. So I'd like to welcome Zach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, hi, I'm Zach. As Jeffrey said, I've done a lot of work in New York on Broadway, but I've also done a lot of stuff outside of Broadway as well, including theme parks, corporate events, museums, all that fun stuff. All the other things that when you go and talk to undergrad students who are learning about theater and they say, there's other ways we can tell these stories besides inside the proscenium. And I say, absolutely. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my design philosophy. So what I call it the visual art of music. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself first and how I got here. My father was a scenic designer, and much like plumbers or a lot of other kind of jobs with manual labor, there was a lot of Borovary and Son work when I was growing up. But I also was a musician, and I used that as my sort of way to run away from theater. But I didn't really run that far. I ran into the pit orchestra. And there was a time, I'm working in New York as a musician and also as a kind of graphic designer, because that was right around the time when things were shifting from the pencil to the computer. And I had a lot of experience with computers because at the same time that I was learning about becoming a musician, it was when we were shifting from the tape to the computer. And so I spent a lot of time at Berklee College of Music, working in recording studios, dealing with computers. And I saw a Broadway show that had video in it, and a light bulb went off in my head. It was like this show, it was the Rocky Horror Show at Circle and Square Theater, and the projections were designed by Batwin and Robin Productions. And I said to myself, this is the incorporation of all of my interests at once. It has computers, it has this imagery, it's the theatrical storytelling, and there's music involved. And I think that this is something that I want to learn. And it turned out that at that time, there was only one way to learn it, which was to become an apprentice, basically, which is something that I knew all about because I had been my father's scenic apprentice my whole childhood. So I went to this company, Batwin and Robin, and I said, hey, I'd like to come work with you guys. I'm good with computers. I can do all this stuff. And it turned out that most of the people that worked there hated working in theater because it was they liked this thing called the outdoors. And I grew up in theater, so I didn't mind being in the dark all day. So they were like, great, you're going to be the theater guy. And they gave me some work, and I got a chance to do all kinds of fun things. It was right at that shift when not only were computers starting to take over in the world of video and projections, but that laptops became powerful enough that we could actually bring our equipment into the theater, which was a big change as well. And what I found as I started to develop my own skills as a designer is that I was still bringing my musical approach, my same compositional approach, but in a visual sense. And I know we just talked about sort of the evolution of the concept of a storyteller. So I'm going to use that concept in my spiel here. But a lot of what I'm talking about as a storyteller is about this game of relationships, which I feel like in the same way as a jazz musician is a storyteller, that as a visual artist, we're a storyteller. And what we're doing is we're finding ways to make connections between the different elements, and also different ways to make connections to the audience member or the guest or whatever you're calling the person who's experiencing your content. I also am going to go back and forth between calling it projections and media and content. Really, they're all kind of the same thing. One of the things that's interesting about projections, especially in theater, is that we still call the job of the person who creates the media and designs the system for which the media is integrated into the scenery. We call that person a projection designer, even though we have evolved well beyond the idea of it only coming from a projected image. Sometimes it's a TV screen, it's an LED monitor, it can be a projection, it can be anything. Uh, I'd like to think that we call it projection designer still, at least in New York and on Broadway, sort of as a tip of the hat to our elders, for which that's where it came from. The other thing that I kind of think about is that idea that you've heard in psychology about projection. It's you're just taking your idea and you're projecting it onto me. You're saying that I did that. But then in a way, I feel like as a designer, we're doing that too. We're taking this emotional content here and we're putting it out onto the audience to try to steer them to think or feel in a certain way or to get a certain response out of them. So in a way, we are projecting our ideas onto the audience as well as projecting our media onto the scenery. So I'm going to start by talking about synesthesia and chromesthesia. I don't know if any of you have heard these terms before. Synesthesia is the production of a sense impression relating to one sense or part of the body by stimulation of another sense or part of the body. So a lot of this is like something you see will trigger something in your mind. Chromesthesia is a type of synesthesia in which sounds automatically and involuntarily evoke an experience of color. So I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the concept of perfect pitch. So that's when a musician is able to sort of pull a note out of thin air and accurately name or accurately reproduce a certain note. And a lot of people who have perfect pitch talk about the association of color with certain notes, that they'll say, that note sounds yellow to me and that note sounds green to me. And that is how they're able to pull those things out of thin air. So there was a study done in 2013 where they found that we're hardwired to connect certain types of music and sound to certain colors. For example, music color matchings were Mozart's Flute Concerto #1 in G major was associated with bright yellow and orange, while the Requiem in D minor, which is a very sad piece, was with a dark bluish gray. So what they're saying there is not only is there that idea that certain people have the ability to make connections with notes and color, but that the general population, even if they don't have perfect pitch, still sort of see very similar colors and have very similar experiences and associations with what's like, for lack of a better way of putting it, a happy sound or a sad sound. If you ever see the Suzuki method of music training, one of the things they talk about with very young children is first learning how to identify a happy sound and a sad sound. If I had a piano here, I demonstrate a major chord and a minor chord. And we don't know, and a lot of we are sort of born with this association that minor is sad and major is happy. And so I've tried to take that kind of thing and go beyond that and figure out how do I take these things one step further in a visual sense. So what I said is, so in Western music, almost all music is broken down by three concepts, which is melody, harmony, and rhythm. Every song you hear, it has a melody, it has harmony, and it has rhythm. So what I thought about was, how do I take these things which are so ingrained in our mind that we have a response to them without even thinking about it, and make these things visual? Like, how can I take my musical training and use that as almost like as a shortcut to design, for visual design? So the first thing I looked at was the melody. So I look at the melody in the visual sense as, what is the thing your eye is attracted to first? What is your audience's eye attracted to first? But then as a storyteller, where do I want their eye to go to first? So it's not just what you see first, but as the person who's designing the content, I want to tell that person where to look first. It's again that idea of projecting my ideas onto the audience. So here's an image here. So in this case, this is a woman. She's in a pink dress, and she's against this black and white scenery that has projected black and white scenery on top of it. So when you first look at this, the first thing you see is the woman, just because she's the thing that's colorful, so she kind of pops out of the image. And in a similar way, the way that the coach here is lit and the way he's against this background that's framed, so there's a melody there. He is the melody in this scene, and he's framed by the harmony and the rhythm, which I'll explain in a moment. Here, this is just another thing, the way it lit. And part of this is again, we're talking about a collaborative art form for the most part, in theater especially. So how you determine these elements and how you create these elements is a team effort. So it's not just what you do with your imagery. So within the imagery, you'll have melody, harmony, and rhythm. But then within the room itself, you'll have that melody, harmony, and rhythm too. And as we sort of move to a post storytelling world, sometimes one of the elements of the melody and harmony and rhythm may even be the audience itself or the venue itself. So then we'll talk about harmony. So harmony to me is, how do you frame and support that melody? How do you visually build a major or minor chord structure? How can we use the idea of harmony to erase the lines between the elements such as scenery, lighting, media, to create a single seamless world, in quotes, for your audience? That was a big thing that I learned when I was a kid with my dad, is he would always talk about that if you want your audience to get sort of lost in the story, what you need to present to them is a seamless world on stage, so that it's just sort of, they buy into it as this is the world. And that one of the things he would tell me is, like, if something is too good, if one element is too good, then it breaks the barriers of the world, and then it's no longer believable again. So it's really, again, of that collaborative process. So taking this in mind, so for instance, in this image, we have these four women who are all the way downstage in front of this image. They're the melody. And then how do we frame these women with our harmony? In this case, we put them inside this image of other people that are in a similar scale to them, so that they feel almost like they're extruded from the image. The way that the image is made in black and white is one of the contributing factors to what I would say makes it more of a minor chord than a major chord. In this image, there was a slow moving, the candles that the people are holding in this vigil kind of pulsated. So again, that was all part of this sort of droning minor chord image that I'm trying to create to frame the melody of the four live actors. And this is a very simple example, but again, the same thing, where the melody is the people in this tavern and the harmony is the forest that's behind them, which, in this case is almost like, it's not necessarily a minor chord because there are little bits of color, so it makes it more kind of confusing and ominous, which was the idea here. And then again, in this case, like, the harmony is definitely the background. So this is the simplest of chords behind this scene here. And then the rhythm, which is the third part of this, is how does the imagery move within that world? The choreography of your imagery, or the choreography of the scenery or the actors. All of those things create the rhythm, the visual rhythm. And then when I say this, projections are transitions. Typically in theater, often the projections become the storytelling device that gets you from point A to point B, because we have that ability to move and to change and to become something different or new more easily than any other element, because our projections are just little bits of light, little pixels of light that don't have to be rebuilt by a scene shop when you want to change them. This is a little video clip from a show that I did that just sort of shows the way that things move. Okay.
It's the finish to the 58th season, folks, and the Green Bay Packers will officially end this year with a record of 1-10-1, having been underwhelmed once, overwhelmed 10 times, and whelmed once.
The Packers, you may know, have not had a winning season in the last 12 years. But a release was issued from the press office earlier today, and a man named Vincent Lombardi has just been named new head coach of the Green Bay Packers.
The most common response from folks on the street seems to be Lombardi. Who the heck is that?
So, the next thing that I was going to touch upon is this. So, as media designers, we, at this point in life, when I started out my career, this was definitely not always the case. But as technology has evolved and prices have become more reasonable, it is very easy for the media to become the biggest, brightest, most distracting thing in the room. And if you create that visual dissonance or a lack of harmony, then what you're doing is like what I said earlier, where if it's very easy to sort of break the world apart by not collaborating. And I can tell you, like, for instance, with Rock of Ages, the show that I did on Broadway, that we ran the video screen at 7% intensity, and it was still very bright. But that's just what we had to do as collaborators. There would always be a time whenever we put up a new production of it or a tour or something where they'd first install the LED screen and it'd be at 100, and everyone would just be like, "Holy crap!" But but it was the case of just because we can doesn't mean we should. And that one of the things that we forget about now, I am very lucky in my career that I came along just as digital was becoming a thing in theater. So the very first show that I did was with slides, and that was also the very last show I ever did with slides. And that was not on purpose. I thought slides as a medium were very interesting, and I've tried to reintegrate them at times and been told, no, we're not going to do that. But that it just was at a time where we didn't have to do that anymore. But one of the things that we've given up on, because we now create this digital environment, is the idea that within the world of slides, when someone like Wendell Harrington, who did Tommy on Broadway, which was probably the be-all end-all of slide projection shows. So I think really that should have been the end of it, because there was nothing else to do with slides after that. She did it all. But when she wanted to make a change, even the simplest change, they really had to think about it, because it was going to cost money and it was going to take time. And so I think that as designers, that we went through a period where we kind of lost that thoughtfulness, because all we had to do was hit a few buttons on the computer, or because we had a library of effects. You have this library of special effects. I often talk about this idea of like a water ripple, that we can press the ripple button and it'll make a ripple, but it doesn't mean it's the right ripple for what the story is that you're trying to tell. But it became like, oh, you want to see the ripple? Sure. You want it faster? You want it slower? You want it bigger? You want it smaller? And we lost that thoughtfulness about the design, and we ended up with some shows like this, where it almost looked like it was a bunch of performers inside a video game. And I don't have footage of this, but the quality, part of what we had with this show was the quality of computer generated graphics was not yet at a time where that relationship or that harmony and melody were able to work together. So you really felt like it was performers standing in front of a screen instead of performers in front of a waterfall. So really, when we think about the idea of projections in theater, what can they do? What are they? What can they be? So as I said, they can be transitions, they can be emotions. And they're ephemeral. So ephemeral is the idea that they are temporary. So that's why they can come and go. And I feel like being aware of that, knowing that they have a short life cycle, that they can be changed, they can be manipulated, is why they have become this transitional element. We do have the workload of both the scenic designer and the lighting designer in many ways, where we're assembling our content, gathering all the bits and pieces, the toys I might call it sometimes, for how we're going to build our show, and then we're in the theater putting it all together and rearranging it and reinventing it. There's been several shows where I was hired to do one thing, and then by the time the show opened, I was doing 30 other things, and the one thing that I was hired to do was the thing we decided not to do. But just sort of this evolution, because we have tools like a laptop where we can create and reinvent what we're doing throughout the show. So this is something I call a moment of Zen. So here's a quote from Bruce Lee. Some of you might know this, where he talks about water. Don't get set into one form. Adapt it and build your own, and let it grow. Be like water. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, and it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, and it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. So in a lot of ways, I like to look at the projections when it is part of a collaborative process as water. Really, we don't want the projections to ever be projections. Like we jokingly say, the worst thing you could ever have is a review where they praise the projections specifically, because then we're not doing our job as a storyteller. We're not becoming part of that world. We're saying, hey, look at me, look at me. But what I found interesting, in addition to this quote, is this quote, which is from 1941. So this is Robert Edmund Jones wrote in his book, The Dramatic Imagination. He's really talking about the idea that there's this new thing called film, and that in the future, there'll be ways to incorporate the film into the theatrical vocabulary, and that he even sees a time where the film might become a character, which at this point, obviously, it has. Especially if you look beyond the theater to places like theme parks and stuff like that, where we're borrowing from all this IP that we know about, like things like Star Wars, where these characters are so embedded in our minds that there's only one way to deliver them in a believable way, which is to deliver that actual character. But we can't have certain actors working in a theme park for the rest of their lives. So we have a video version of them that is become part of the storytelling device. But as you can see from this quote, this is nothing new. A lot of what we're doing is not new. We're just still figuring out ways to make it work. And, we're at a point where, as you saw in the earlier presentation, where, things are very affordable. You probably have most of the tools right here in your pocket to create content. And for a couple $100, you can get a projector and have a show. But because we're at this point, what I think the difference you'll see between people who just make content and people who are storytellers is that the storyteller is trying to find these ways to tap into your brain, how to make a connection between their content and the audience, their content within the framework of whatever else is part of that story, and then how to take that and trigger a response from an audience member, trigger a memory, trigger an emotional response. And I think those are the most successful kinds of media experiences that I've partaken in, are those where they they cause a response in me even without me having to think about how or why. The designer just knows how to tell that story in a way that I can relate to. And with that, I think I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has any. No? No questions? There's a question. My father actually passed away about 10 years ago, but he was working until the moment that he expired. And aside from me, he actually has a number of students who have gone on to become designers and performers on their own. So uh, we were all very lucky. Yep. Sure. The Lombardi play was very interesting because it was at a theater in New York called Circle in the Square, which is the only theater in the round Broadway theater that there is. And so sometimes when, like, for instance, the Rocky Horror Show, which is the show that inspired me to become a designer, when they did that show there, they actually blocked off a section of seats. So it wasn't really in the round for that performance. They built like a proscenium and they just cut out a chunk of seats. But when we did it, we felt, considering the way a football stadium looks, that it would be interesting to embrace this idea of the round. And the challenge there became projecting onto the deck, as well as we built some screens that were around the deck, almost like scoreboards in a football stadium. One of the interesting things there is the NFL was participated in the show, so we had access to a lot of footage, which was really nice. Um, but we did a lot of work to sort of treat the footage to sort of feel otherworldly, because it was almost as if, the idea of that sort of melody and harmony and rhythm, in that the coach was conjuring up these scenes. He's imagining the play in his head, and as he's doing it, it sort of grows around him on the floor. And so a lot of the footage in that show was almost like a memory experience for him. And so it was really interesting to see him sort of being able to walk around within it, experiencing that. So it was a really fun experience to work on.
Zach, what's been one of your most challenging projects that you've come across or that you've worked on?
Challenging. Well, every project has.
Taking you to your limit.
I mean, every project has its own challenges. There's budgetary challenges. A lot of projects happen to have like time challenges. They're like this. We want to do X, Y, and Z, and you have 4 weeks, and so that can be a challenge. So I would say that some of the biggest challenges have been the ones that we just don't have the time to do everything we want. That's part of the good and the bad of being a projection designer, is that we do have the ability to make a lot of changes, and we do have this workflow that starts in pre-production and goes all the way through opening night. But I would say that as a designer, there's always something that I feel like I didn't get to by the time that they throw you out. Yep.
What are some shows that you haven't worked on that you look at and say they're really cool?
I mean, I really like. I've seen lots of Broadway shows. That show MJ, the Michael Jackson show, has a lot of really interesting video work in it. One of the things I thought was really bold in that is they have a big video wall that's outside. It's supposed to be outside of a window, and almost all the content for that is blurry. And I felt like that was a really bold choice, because you have the ability to make things sharp and in focus. But by making it blurry, again, it sort of feeds into that idea of the harmony. Like, this is not supposed to be interesting. This is just supposed to be like, okay, it's a window, I'm going to move on. And that by blurring that content, it's telling your subconscious, you don't need to look at this. This is just a window. But it was like I'm imagining that it was a huge investment to get a full stage LED video wall to just run blurry content on for 2 hours. But it worked. So that was really interesting. I really like a lot of the stuff that the theme parks do with projection mapping. I've done some of that as well, but unfortunately, I'm not supposed to talk about it, so I've already said too much. I really love the stuff that people do at rock concerts. It's always fun. When they take the idea of image magnification and try to turn it into a design, instead of just like, here's a little version of the guy and here's a big version of the guy. I've seen some really interesting stuff being done in that arena as well. No pun intended. Mm-hmm.
How do you find the creative directors? Do you find sometimes they have either like an idea in their head which like, well, we could do better. I mean, you've obviously got something to bring to the table. Describe that process.
Yeah, I mean it's mixed. Especially when I was starting out, you'd have a lot of directors who hadn't worked with projections before, and there still seems to be quite a few who have not. So there's an educational process there of this is what I can do, this is what I think we should do, this is what I think we shouldn't do. There's also the education process of just because you saw a picture that you liked in a book doesn't mean we can use that in the show. There's a photographer that has to be compensated for that, or there's a famous person in that picture, and we can't just like use it in the show without permission. So there's a lot of education that goes into that. We could do a whole separate discussion about the licensing and rights for images. That's a really big thing, especially in theater. But a lot of it is this sort of collaborative process where somebody might have a guiding idea. Like one show I did was called The Catered Fair, and the director had this like colorized 1950s photo of a bride, and he was like, I want the show to look and feel like this. And so it was my job and the scenic designer and the lighting designer's job to figure out like, how do we take this one photo and turn it into like a whole environment? And so there were a lot of great conversations that went into that, and we all did our own research, and we showed up at the next meeting for the director with like, here's each of us thought these 100 photos reminded us of your one photo. What do you think of these? So there's a lot of research, and research can be really, really fun sometimes, especially I especially enjoy when it's like something historical and you get to learn a lot about a new subject that you never knew about before. So I became quite a scholar about Eva Peron after I did the revival of Evita. Like some stuff I never thought I would need to know about, and probably don't. But it was interesting to learn about, so that's one of the side joys of the job.
Like when you get into the licensing or using an image, whose responsibility does that become?
Oh, that is a good question. And it has several answers. I mean, on one hand, in like a pure theatrical production, you might have an agent who handles your contract. And in your contract, there might be some language about indemnity, saying something like, I will do my best as the designer to clear the rights for whatever images we're using. If there's something that we really want to use that we can't figure out, we will provide you with all the information we can. And you, as the person with more money and lawyers, which are things I don't have, say you'll try to figure out either how we can use this image, or you promise to use the money and the lawyers to protect us if so and so shows up at some point. I did work on a show early in my career which had several interesting rights issues. So it was a musical about the pop artist Keith Haring, and one of the issues was Keith Haring had published a book with his best friend who was a photographer, and the book was photographs of Keith Haring with like his chalk drawings in the subway and stuff like that. And when they published the book, they were like young artists who were just trying to have fun and make a buck. So they didn't really think about what happens when Keith Haring becomes famous. But then he did. And then, 20 years later, we did a musical about it. And at that point, there was still an ongoing argument between the estate of the photographer and the estate of Keith Haring as to who owned the work. Does the photographer who took the picture own the work? Or does the artist who created the artwork that's in the picture own the work? And because we couldn't sort it out, we ended up just not being able to use any of that artwork. Now, similarly, there was some other sort of 1980s New York architecture photography that we wanted to use. We reached out to the photographer and he never responded. So we were like, you know what? We're just going to go for it. And we went for it, and then he spoke up, and it was at a nonprofit theater company, and they said, would you like to donate the use of this artwork? We'll give you a receipt for 10 grand. And he said, that sounds great. So that worked out well there too. When you get into some shows where you might need to bring in a researcher, a lot of times that person will assist in the rights management. You know, when I brought in a researcher for Avita because we found that we reached out to the Eva Perón Museum in Argentina, and they sent us a bunch of stuff, and they were like, you can use anything you want. But it was all the stuff that was copywritten in America that they just don't know about or respect in Argentina. So I was like, nope, can't use that. So we brought in a researcher who also found all the stuff, found where these things came from so we could get rights to it. Yes.
Hey, Zach, we have a question from
Sure.
somebody streaming live on the USITT YouTube page.
Oh, wow.
How do you balance projected media with lighting?
That is a great question. And one of the things I was going to say is that I feel like we're at this wonderful cross section where it's not that our equipment has become brighter, that we can compete with lighting, but that we have been around long enough that lighting designers have learned how to work with us. And we have learned how to work with lighting designers. So we now have a dialogue that's ongoing. I often, when I'm in tech for a show, I like to sit right next to the lighting designer and have a conversation with them. And, you know, part of it is going in there with no ego. You know, a lot of this is like, I might say to the lighting designer, can you bring that down? And he might say, can you bring that down? Or can you turn that blue? Can you match my green? You know, things like that. So I think that what has happened is we've gotten to a point where we've all been around long enough and our tool sets have sort of, you know how they say, like, as a couple gets older, they start to dress like each other. That I think, you know, the lighting tool set and the projection tool set have started to dress like each other. And so we're able to have a much more productive dialogue now. You know, we're not the Wild West anymore. So we're able to, you know, I know enough lighting terms to get me in trouble. They know enough projection terms to get themselves in trouble, and we just try not to get in trouble together.
Do you think there's a point at which you'll start to, or people will start to see projectors as lights in themselves?
I mean, I think we already have. You know, one of the projects that I've done for a theme park, especially, part of what happens in that show is there's a transition from lighting to projections. And the way that it sort of happens in a seamless way is that at the beginning of the show, we simulate the lighting that they have going on there with the projector. I think that we're seeing more and more of stuff like that. I mean, I think that the issue in some ways, you know, like I'm still hoping for like the great 20,000 lumen waterproof projector that doesn't exist yet. I mean, the lighting equivalent of that does exist, although it's pretty pricey. But it seems like that outdoor use, all weather, seems to be one of the things that I think is holding it back. Anyone else?
You had mentioned earlier that we're sort of moving into like a post-storytelling world. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, storytelling is visual storyteller. The term is like what convergence was 10 years ago, where like it was awesome, and then we all got sick of it. That I think that the idea, you know, for me, it's like that idea of as long as what I'm doing is creating harmony, or if it's creating dissonance, that the dissonance is on purpose, and then it's a desired effect. You know, I think that when I call it the post storytelling era, it's sort of like, you know, I used to do lectures at these events that were all people that did like car shows and stuff like that, and I would say we can tell the story, and you know, the main character in the story is your Hyundai, and they'd be like, oh, that's amazing. But when I say the post storytelling world, I feel like, you know, it's almost like we're looking at new ways to be almost like drugs. You know, now I can just like put up an image that creates a direct emotional response. I've now bypassed the idea of telling a linear narrative. And I'm just like, I'm going to do something that makes you sad. You know, I'm going to do something that makes you happy. I mean, I think that's a lot of what that graffiti festival is. It's like, you know, we're also not we don't have 2 hours for you to look at this building. So we just need you to get in there, have a feeling, and keep moving. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see, you know, I have 2 kids that are 9 and 13 who grew up in and around what I do. So they're much more theater savvy than most kids their age, but at the same time, they're still the same as all the other kids their age. And like they don't want to sit through a show that's not daddy's show because they want to go look at YouTube instead. And they see things like YouTube and TikTok as potential careers, which scares the shit out of me. Just like probably being a musician scared the shit out of my parents. Yes. I think that it's a way to kind of have a relationship, you know, like when you go and look at a piece of art, any kind of art, painting, theater, you know, projected experience, theme park attraction. It's what, when I say an emotional response, it doesn't necessarily have to be like happy, sad. It might be, it brings up a memory, you know, and that memory might be the time I did this when I was a kid, or when I saw this movie, or the smell reminds me of Thanksgiving or something like that. That those are ways we kind of we have relationships with our environment. And I think that you know, like we often say in theater, if somebody absolutely hates something and they're passionate about how much they hate it, then that's better than somebody who's just like, meh, and they have nothing to say, because then you didn't make a connection with them. And sometimes it's a bad connection, but still, like evoking some kind of emotional response, showing that you were able to use your artwork to sort of make a person think for a second about something, that it brought something up in their mind, I think is just that's one of the like few ways that I think we can look at art as being successful or not. I mean, you know, it's just sort of how we experience things. Mhm.
Do you think that storytelling aspect is kind of baked into the theater? Because that's,
Yeah.
it's you know, you're gonna sit there, you're gonna address it in a particular way, and it's meant to be a linear.
Yes, I absolutely. I think with theater, I mean, with any of these experiences, I think when you go in, you know, you have a series of expectations. You know, like as you said in your presentation, when you go to certain things, you're going in expecting it to be cool and say, "How cool is this?" When you go into theater, you're like, "Okay, I paid a lot of money. I'm gonna be here for 2 hours. I hope that for 2 hours I don't think about, you know, my own life. I want to be invested in these characters. You know, that's just what that experience is about." You know, and when I go on a theme park attraction, my expectation is that I'm going to have what I consider to be a near-death experience. I mean, that's what all the theme park attractions are. It's like it was just an ordinary day, and then something went wrong, and then you spend the next 4 minutes trying to correct that, and then gift shop. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much.